evening. On behalf of the Citizen Initiative Study Team, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this meeting. We hope to whet your appetites so you will consider getting more involved. Our speaker this evening is Asher Hildebrand. He is a professor of the practice at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy, where he teaches courses on domestic politics and policy analysis and leads seminars on legislative advocacy and American democracy. He is also the inaugural director of Duke's Executive Master of Public Affairs program, which will welcome its first cohort of students in 2025. Congratulations, Asher. That's really exciting news.
Thanks, Ellen.
Prior to joining Duke's faculty, Asher served in government and politics for more than 15 years, holding senior leadership roles as Chief of Staff to U.S. Representative David Price and as Director of Policy and Research for President Barack Obama's 2012 campaign in North Carolina. Asher appears regularly in the media as a commentator on state and national politics, the U.S. Congress, and challenges facing American democracy, such as gerrymandering and voting rights. Before we turn the floor over to Asher, Ariane just has a few things that she wants to go over vis-a-vis logistics.
I'm Ariane Hartzel-Gundy. I'm a volunteer with the ODC chapter of the League, and I'm your tech support for the evening. I think a lot of us know the drill, but I'll go over just a little bit on the logistics. Please keep yourself on mute, and we ask you to put any questions you have in the chat. And after Dr. Hildebrand talks, there will be a time where a couple of the members of the committee will respond to the questions you put into chat. As you know, we are being recorded. If you are uncomfortable with that, you are welcome to leave or hide your camera. We've also asked that for the breakout rooms, we're hoping to be able to organize people so that we don't have all awake in one room or all of Piedmont in one room. So if you have not done so, if you can go over your image in the box and with your cursor, and you should see 3 dots that appear. And if you click on those 3 dots, you'll see rename as an option. And we're asking if you are a member of one of the leagues in North Carolina or one of the malls that you identify which one you are in. And that is for the breakout rooms later.
Thank you, Ariane. So please do that. And now I will turn the virtual floor over to Asher.
Well, thank you, Ellen. And it's great to see everybody virtually on this, what is a very stormy evening, at least in Durham here. I'm looking out my window as the leaves on the trees tremble. It's hard to believe that it's been a year already since we had a preliminary conversation on this topic with the ODC chapter. And so I'm very pleased to be joining volunteers and others from all across the state. I appreciate the generous introduction. I should say that topics such as this are very central to why I chose to come to Duke and to the Sanford School in the first place. And the perspective I bring to it is partly that of an academic, someone who has tried since I've been here to really immerse myself in the empirical data surrounding reforms such as this, but also very much that of a practitioner, someone who, while working in government, saw the many ways in which policy outcomes were disconnected from the will of the people. And that was true at the federal level. I would say over the last decade plus, it's been especially true at the state level. And I don't think I need to put too fine a point on that. I should say, by way of disclaimer, this is an updated presentation from the one I gave a year ago. And so if you were in that meeting last May, I apologize if any of this material is old news for you. but my charge tonight was to bring the same analysis to this broader audience, and so I'm trying to be faithful to that charge. I'll also begin, as I did a year ago, with just by acknowledging that the battle for the future of American democracy has many fronts. And as we barrel toward a presidential election with unimaginably high stakes, it may feel a little quaint to be gathered here tonight talking about an electoral reform that is, being honest, a fairly distant possibility in a state like North Carolina. Well, I won't diminish the stakes of the many urgent challenges that we're facing, or the need for all of us to roll up our sleeves and be a part of solving those challenges. But I will contend that moments of crisis are actually the perfect time to be thinking about major reforms to the status quo. And indeed, that history shows us that moments of crisis have very often given way to moments of opportunity for change. And so I'm grateful to the League of Women Voters for creating space to think big about topics like this, even as a million other demands and anxieties press in on us. The question before you is not whether we could wish this reform into existence tomorrow, if only that were true. It is whether the League should embrace it as part of a broader long-term strategy for improving our democracy. And I think that's the right conversation to be having. And so I again, appreciate the invitation to be a part of it. I'm going to start just with some definitional work. What are citizen initiatives? That may be self-evident to some of you, but there's a lot of terminology that gets thrown around when we're talking about direct democracy. So I want to be clear about what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. Then I'll go through what the evidence and experience shows about some of the pros and cons of citizen initiatives, the ways in which they've been a powerful way to engage people in democratic participation, as well as some of the cautionary tales about what can happen if they're not designed and implemented in the right way. Then we'll turn to North Carolina with a very direct look at the lay of the land here, and then close with just a few closing thoughts about where we might go from here, which hopefully will tee you up for your breakout sessions. If you have any questions along the way, please put them in the chat, interject, especially if something's not clear, and I'll do my best to clarify them. So starting with this question of what citizens initiatives are, you often hear the term ballot measure, right? Which is any measure that is that appears on your ballot and asks for your direct input on, right? Other than the candidates. And to complicate matters further, sometimes that's called an initiative or a ballot question, or in some states, a proposition. But the majority of ballot measures, that is, of the actual questions that appear on the ballots, actually get there through legislative referendum, where, in other words, the state legislature will vote to place the question on the ballot. Of course, we're familiar with that in North Carolina because every ballot measure we've ever had has come only and always through legislative referendum. And there are different types of that. Legislative referendum often involves an amendment to the state constitution. We've had several high-profile debates over those over the last decade, but it can also involve convening a constitutional convention, or, as Ellen and others who have been involved in local government know, for bond measures that the legislature approves or refers to local ballots. So even though it's only the voters of Durham or Wilmington or Raleigh or other municipalities that are voting on those, they're also legislatively referred. Citizen initiatives, by contrast, are initiated directly by citizens, as the name implies. And there are lots of different forms that citizen initiatives can take, but the four main ones are an initiated statute, which is essentially an equivalent to the statute that would be passed by a legislature, but it's placed on the ballot directly. An initiated constitutional amendment, a veto referendum, sometimes called a popular referendum, which is a tool for citizens to overturn a law that's been enacted by the legislature. And then the fourth, which I'm not going to spend much time on tonight, is a recall election, which in some states or jurisdictions allows citizens to recall elected officials. Since we're really focused on sort of the direct legislative role of these initiatives, I'm going to focus mostly on these three tonight. Little bit of history here. The conventional telling of American history holds that the constitutional framers were skeptical of, if not downright hostile toward, direct democracy. And I certainly won't dispute that narrative, since the legacy of their skepticism is so plainly evident in so many of the Republican structures they created, from the Senate to the Electoral College to lifetime appointments of unelected Supreme Court justices. But I will complicate the narrative a bit, because forms of direct democracy existed on the American continent before the United States did, including among some indigenous nations, but also in many of the American colonies. You hear, of course, of the New England town meeting as a sort of classic example of that. In fact, Thomas Jefferson argued unsuccessfully for a legislative referendum to be included in Virginia's state constitution in 1775. Delegates to Georgia's state constitutional convention the following year debated a similar idea. And in 1778, Massachusetts became the first state to hold a statewide legislative referendum, which it used to ratify its state's constitution. Even James Madison, the father of the federal constitution, wrote in the Federalist Papers that when all else fails, power should inhere in the people. So while many of the Constitution's structures were arguably designed to frustrate or at least moderate direct democracy, this is an idea that
about you and your
there we go. This is an idea that sort of deeply rooted in Enlightenment ideals and has been prominent in our political debate since the very earliest days of the Republic. That said, it wasn't till the close of the 19th century when states really began to adopt forms of direct democracy on a more widespread basis. And this was a fascinating moment in our history, not unlike today, perhaps, when many Americans perceived government to be serving the interests of wealthy industrialists and increasingly impervious to the will of the people. So in the face of this, populist farmers and laborers joined together with progressive reformers to advocate for many of the sweeping changes we now associate with the progressive era: the secret ballot, direct primary elections, the first campaign finance regulations, of course, women's suffrage, and in many states, especially on the Western frontier, the adoption of citizen initiatives or referenda. Saliently absent from this wave of progressive reform was most of the American South, where by the time these reforms were adopted in other states, one-party rule had largely taken hold following the abandonment of Reconstruction by the federal government. And in those states, in the southern states, white elites, having witnessed what representative democracy actually looked like in their states during Reconstruction, were not eager to devolve more power to the people. And so you see most of the South, and to be fair, a large chunk of the original 13 colonies and the mid-Atlantic are kind of noticeably absent from this list. With a few exceptions in the latter half of the 20th century, this wave of progressive reforms over a century ago gave us the landscape we see today, with 26 states providing for at least some form of voter initiative, of statewide citizen-initiated ballot measure. And while most states that have adopted referenda or initiatives have done so with broad public support, not every state has succeeded. During the early wave of adoption, voters in Texas and Wisconsin rejected the initiative process. Minnesota has tried and failed 3 times to adopt a referendum, due mostly to a quirk in its state constitution that requires a majority of all voters to approve constitutional amendments and not just a majority of those who show up to the polls. Now, the specific shape that these initiatives take varies widely from state to state, and how the process is designed is actually pretty crucial to how much voice it actually gives the people and to some of the downside risks that we'll talk about in a moment. Think about all of the steps that must go into a ballot measure. First, you have this process of initiating it. Who is eligible to initiate it? What is the threshold for gathering signatures on a petition? What kind of geographical distribution is required for those signatures? Must they be physical? Are online signatures acceptable? Then you look at the scope of the measure itself, and in some states, they require that initiatives have only one issue. In other states, you can have multiple issues in a single initiative. In terms of access to the ballot, there's direct access, indirect via the legislature. In other words, the legislature will develop the language for the ballot, all kinds of question wording and placement concerns that arise, questions about the campaign and how it's regulated, including campaign finance, disclosure of donors, and then how it's implemented. Is it directly implemented, or must the legislator enact additional implementing regulation? Finally, should there be a waiting period before an initiative that is adopted can be reviewed or revoked? We'll come back to some of these considerations in a bit, but for now, our main takeaways are that a majority of states have some form of citizen initiative process, that the details of this process varies widely by state, and that these variations matter for how we might evaluate both the impact and the wisdom of citizen initiatives. Whatever their shape, over the last 120 years or so, this form of direct democracy has been used to decide all manner of policy questions, from dueling and adult entertainment to labor rights and affirmative action. According to Ballotpedia, from 1904 to 2023, a total of 3,217 citizen-initiated measures appeared on state ballots, with voters approving a little over 40% of them, about 1,300 of them. And of course, one reason we're here today is because citizen initiatives have received renewed interest and more frequent use over the past couple of decades. Another time of widespread perception that government is serving the interests of a select few and unresponsive to the will of the people. In fact, in the last 3 even-year elections alone, nearly 150 statewide ballot measures received consideration across the country, and this has produced some major victories in a range of policy areas, from raising the minimum wage to creating independent redistricting commissions to securing abortion rights. This trend will continue in 2024. As of May 1st, 90 ballot measures had qualified for the 2024 ballot. 19 of those are citizen initiated. The rest are legislatively referred. And this graph gives you a sense of, and again, this is lumping together citizen initiatives and legislative referrals, but it gives you a sense of, when voters go to the polls this fall, the range of topics that they'll be voting on through this direct ballot questions. Now, all of this has also produced a growing backlash against direct democracy. In recent years, hundreds of bills to restrict the use of citizens' initiatives have been filed in state legislatures across the country. So far in the current legislative cycle, 21 bills have been enacted that change procedures for initiatives and other ballot measures, and most of those bills are in the direction of restricting them. Some of them have been in the other direction, but the majority have been restrictive. That includes actually a provision tucked into the North Carolina budget last year by the General Assembly that tightens the requirements for local bond referenda by requiring more information to be disclosed by voters in a way that many interpreted as trying to bias voters against bond referenda. And in addition to all of these bills, at least 5 ballot initiatives related to ballot initiatives will be on the ballot this fall, if you can get your mind around that. So it's not an understatement to say that citizen initiatives are a key front right now in the battle for the future of American democracy. So again, I think it's a pretty good time to be having this discussion. So unless there are any questions, I'll go ahead and turn to the case for and against citizens initiatives, starting with the case in favor. And there are sort of 4 areas that scholars, advocates, and others have looked at when they make the case for citizens initiatives. The first is that they serve as a check on the power of government. The second is that they increase voter turnout. The third is that they advance political equality by giving voice and engagement to marginalized voters. And the fourth is that they transcend and perhaps reduce partisan polarization. So I'll look at each of these briefly in turn, and then we'll talk about cons. In terms of serving as a check on the power of government, this was in many ways the original rationale of citizen initiatives, right, of direct democracy. And there have been some pretty good empirical evidence to support this rationale. One study found that US states that have citizen initiative processes are more likely to have adopted governance reform measures, such as term limits or campaign finance regulations. Another study, actually out of Switzerland, found that the initiation of ballot measures often led the legislature to act on issues, sort of allowing the initiatives to be withdrawn. You see that sometimes at the local level, where the sort of threat of initiative can lead government to act. In the current era, we can also conceive of this check on government not just in terms of preventing the legislature from doing bad things, but also in terms of circumventing the legislature when it refuses to take action on policies that have broad public support. And there have been some striking examples of this in recent years, perhaps nowhere more striking than in Kansas, where voters a couple years ago rejected an attempt to ban abortion in the Constitution and therefore enshrined abortion rights. And this is an analysis the New York Times did that sort of took the breakdown of the electorate in Kansas for that ballot measure and said, if we were to redo this ballot measure in every state in the country, how it would turn out. And as you see, the results are pretty astounding, right? In only 7 states would have restricted abortion rights in this ballot measure. The other 43 states, including some pretty red ones, if the same cross-section of the electorate turned out in those states that turned out in Kansas, right, there would be a much stronger result. And so, again, this provides some pretty good evidence that when it comes to aligning the outcomes of government with the will of the people, that this is a pretty powerful tool. When it comes to increasing turnout, there is also widespread evidence that initiatives and referenda increase voter turnout by, according to one macro analysis, by between 3 and 8%, depending on the election. Now, there's some debate over the mechanism for this. Is it a short-term sort of mobilization effect that depends on the issue on the ballot and the context of the election? Or is it a longer-term effect of what's sometimes called participatory momentum? In other words, and I'm sure some of you are good examples of this, right? You do one thing political and all of a sudden you find you're doing 5 or 7 or 9 things that are engaged in politics, right? And there's some speculation that ballot measures have something like that effect. The evidence is slightly stronger for the sort of short-term effect, but if that sounds disappointing, there's also a silver lining to it, which is that even in jurisdictions that have no history of ballot measures, their adoption has been found to increase turnout. In other words, it doesn't take years of building participatory momentum for them to have an impact. All you need is a measure on the ballot, and it can have the desired effect, even if it's sort of new to the voters of a state. And this effect is especially pronounced the further you go down the ballot, for example, in midterm elections as opposed to presidential years, and in local elections as opposed to state and federal elections. One study, which I'll put some graphs from on the screen now, this on the left graph shows initiative state turnout overall, and that's across a period of time in both presidential and midterm years. And then on the right, it shows just the differential turnout in midterm years. And you see on average, you see about a 5 or 6% higher turnout rate, in some cases quite higher, depending on the election. So there too, the evidence is pretty strong. In terms of advancing political equality, so in addition to increasing turnout overall, this should say advanced political equality, but in addition to increasing turnout overall, there is evidence that initiatives reduce inequality by bringing underrepresented populations into the electorate, producing more representative policy outcomes. And this makes sense intuitively, but it's also backed up by a growing body of evidence. One study out of Sweden found that the introduction of local ballot initiatives not only increased women's turnout for those initiatives, but also increased their turnout in national elections and their participation in other political activities. Another study found that American states with the most accessible initiative processes tend to weigh citizens' views more equally and produce more egalitarian policy outcomes. And that finding's been supported internationally as well. And the 2022 election provides one striking example of that. In 2022, among youth voters, Michigan led the nation with about 37% youth turnout. That's about 14 percentage points higher than in North Carolina. And there are a number of reasons why this may be, but certainly among them was the presence of an abortion initiative on the ballot, which youth voters rated by far their number one issue when they went to the polls relative to older voters. So again, a lot of evidence that these are great ways to kind of bring new people into the process and level the playing field just a bit. Finally, in terms of transcending partisan polarization, there are sort of two aspects to this. The first is that the fact that ballot initiatives are not associated with parties or candidates, at least formally. They might be supported by them, but there's no D or R next to them on the ballot, right? This sort of de-emphasizes the party identification and allows for cross-partisan coalitions of support. And one real striking example of this was when Arkansas passed a minimum wage by citizen initiative, was passed pretty broadly. And then there was an effort by some leaders, some Republican leaders, to try to change or sort of frustrate the implementation of it. And the state Republican Party actually issued a statement saying, wait a minute, we like this, we want to keep this, right? Because it had proved so popular. So that's one aspect to it. The other aspect is that initiatives can give states just an important policy tool at a time when the federal government is often gridlocked by polarization. And so it's a way to sort of overcome the partisan gridlock at a time when there's plenty of that to go around. One final and important argument in favor of initiatives is that evidence shows that many of these benefits actually accrue regardless of whether an initiative passes or not. Voters are still engaged. State legislatures still factor the possibility of initiatives into their policy decisions, and campaign debates still focus on issues instead of parties. So it doesn't take winning an initiative from your perspective, whatever side that is, for them to sort of have these desired effects. That said, they're not without risk. And so I'll talk briefly about some of the risks. And for each of these, I'll also offer some evidence-based suggestions for how these risks can be mitigated. The first is that they generate complexity and confusion for voters. The second is that they destabilize policy and politics, sometimes called policy whiplash. The third is that they can be exploited by special interests. And the fourth is that they sometimes lead to outcomes that violate minority rights or that otherwise sort of would be considered a tyranny of the majority. In other words, you have to be careful what you ask for, because once you put this tool in the hands of the people, sometimes the people decide to adopt policies that are not progressive or are not respectful of minority rights. So just briefly, it is certainly the case that ballot initiatives, depending on how they're worded and structured, can be complex and confusing. Here's a snapshot of one that would barely fit on the screen from Alaska initiative in 2014, right? I mean, I can't understand what all of this means. I'm not Alaskan. I can't understand what all of this means. And so asking the average voter going to the poll to also understand something as complex as this is a challenge. That said, there are lots of mitigation strategies available to states, starting with limiting initiatives to one topic as opposed to multiple topics, imposing a word limit on their descriptions. Sometimes states require them to be yes/no questions, with yes meaning change and no meaning no change, and just using plain language. And some states, actually, one of the recent reforms that was passed, I think in Colorado, though could have been New Mexico, actually created a new committee or a new commission that's going to be tasked with drafting the language. So that's taking that drafting function out of the hands of politicians and putting it in a commission that's charged with this. Second risk is this idea of policy instability and whiplash. And this has kind of both a near-term and a long-term element. In the near term, the wording of ballot measures may create some ambiguity or unintended consequences when it comes to their implementation. But in the long term, right, you might have ballot measures that are overturned or superseded by new initiatives or state legislatures and executives. And so you can get this whiplash effect. The classic case here is California. I probably don't need to say much more about that. There have been a number of things that California has done and then undone or redone. And there's just a bewildering number of citizen initiatives that are on the ballot in California in any given year, including, I think, 3 this fall. But there are also, some more recent examples like Florida, whose voters created a constitutional right to enfranchise people who had been convicted of felonies. But then the Republican legislature, with support from the governor, sort of voted to undermine it. The governors, they've required fees to be repaid, court fees to be repaid before the rights can be reinstated. And ultimately, the courts sided with the legislature and the governor on it, which sort of didn't totally annul, but certainly complicated and limited the impact that the voters had desired to have. And so again, this isn't necessarily an argument against, but it is an argument for being careful, for example, by being very clear in the language of initiatives and by requiring a waiting period of a couple of years, at least, before initiatives can be undone or changed by the voters. In terms of exploitation by special interests, I guess my cynical response to this would be that, pretty much all of our elections are exploited by special interests. So that's not necessarily unique by special interests, by citizens' initiatives. But what is unique, of course, is that there's not a candidate or a party associated with them. So there's a real risk of very obscure and sort of opaque organizations coming into existence to fund them. Sometimes they're less obscure. This is a picture from a local initiative in San Francisco that was trying to restrict short-term rentals, which Airbnb spent millions of dollars in advertising to defeat. And this is from Illinois, an unsuccessful state initiative to improve the state's income tax system. You see the 2 top spenders. There was a coalition opposed, which spent, about 60 million, and then a coalition for, which spent about 58 million. If you look at the donors to vote yes for fairness, you see 58 million of that total amount came from one donor who happened to be the governor of Illinois. And while I was sympathetic with the aims of this particular initiative, I think it's probably not controversial to say that the sitting governor spending $58 million of his own fortune to advance a state initiative is not exactly a good look in terms of good governance, right? So here too, there are some mitigation tools, including very clear campaign finance and disclosure rules for initiatives, as well as appropriately set signature requirements that make sure there's sort of a broad distribution of voters that are expressing support for the initiative. Finally, in terms of tyranny of the majority, here too, this is really kind of the big one because there's only so much you can do to mitigate it. And there are very clear examples over time when citizens' initiative have had detrimental and at times harmful effects to the public good. The most famous example here is Proposition 13 in California, which was adopted way back in 1977. And this graph shows in the blue line local property taxes. The proposition capped local property taxes or made it very hard for municipalities to raise them. The yellow line shows the state income tax over that same time period. And so California municipalities have been totally hamstrung in their revenue because of this initiative. And the results have been clear. This is a little outdated, but this is school spending per pupil, which was declining at a time when the state was growing. Property turnover has been way down. It's been really impossible for California to get a handle on the housing crisis because of this, and the state's spending a lot of money right now to try to fix this, right? So lots of downstream effects. But of course, we've got some examples closer to home in North Carolina as well, whereas recently as 2012, we passed a legislatively referred ballot measure to ban same-sex marriage. And then, of course, we are now living under the voter ID constitutional amendment that voters passed in 2018. So again, it's kind of hard to draw an overarching conclusion about whether citizens' initiatives are sort of better or worse on balance, right? The part is it is fair to say that they don't only cut in a progressive direction, and that if we're going to embrace them, then we have to be, willing to take the bad with the good, or at least maybe, to put it in a different way, that whether it's a risk that we should take depends a lot on how much trust we place in the wisdom of voters, right? All right, just a couple slides here, and then we'll wrap it up and get you all to breakouts, and I'm happy to answer any questions if they arise. But again, North Carolina is not a state that has any kind of citizens initiative process. In fact, North Carolina has never even considered in a statewide ballot question whether to adopt a referendum process. There were some, that said, there were some reforms that sort of took steps in the direction of direct democracy in North Carolina, and that still exists today. And so I'm going to talk about those briefly. The first, of course, is that we do have this constitutional amendment process. The legislative referendum that I already mentioned requires 3/5 approval by each chamber. That's pretty mainstream. Does not require the governor's signature, but then voters must approve it. And again, there is the barriers to getting something on the ballot are quite high. But once it's on the ballot, it does give citizens some chance to participate directly. And then there's also a provision for constitutional conventions. Requires actually 2/3 approval, and then voter approval of proposed amendments. There has not been a convention since 1875, although we have approved or amended the Constitution multiple times since then through legislative referendum. At the local level, there is, in some places, a local initiative process. In fact, in all municipalities, there is an initiative process for charter amendments for a limited range of changes, such as the name of the municipality, the size, the type of the governing board, the terms of the members, modes of election, districts. And while some of this stuff is kind of, the inside baseball of politics, some of it's very important, right? In fact, Raleigh, those of you over there may be aware, is going through this debate right now because the city council changed the size of or the terms of the members. And some groups don't like the fact that the council chose to do that by adopting the ordinance instead of by putting the ordinance on the ballot. So now there's an effort underway to force the council to put these changes on the ballot this fall. There are some municipalities in North Carolina that also have local initiative power for ordinances. There are restrictions on that. They cannot use ordinances or they cannot use ordinance initiatives to levy new taxes or approve the local budget. But there are cities, including Raleigh, Greensboro, and Wilmington, that can use initiative powers for ordinances. And there are examples of them being used, for example, in Wilmington to stop the placement of a toxic waste facility by using a local zone, changing local zoning laws through ordinance initiative, right? I'll come back to that in a second because I think it's really an intriguing area for future study that's been kind of underappreciated and underutilized maybe in our state. There have been over time proposals to adopt or enact a citizen initiative process. Like many other reforms in North Carolina, Republicans were some of the early advocates for this, right? When they were frozen out of power, much like redistricting reform as well. And look with some irony at this bill from 2009 that had among its sponsors Tim Moore to create an initiative process, right? So this can and should be a bipartisan issue. But since taking power in 2011, the interest of the current majority in local initiatives has, to put it politely, cooled somewhat. And to my knowledge, there has not been any legislation to create a citizens initiative process that has been introduced in the current legislative session. So just to close, where do we go from here? A couple of broad conclusions, and then I'm going to suggest a couple of potential pathways for action. In terms of broad conclusions, this is a long-standing and occasionally powerful form of direct democracy that can check the power of government, increase turnout, advance equality, and transcend polarization. Lots of good there. It also carries risks to governance, to minority rights, that must be mitigated through careful design and implementation decisions. While the majority of states allow some form of citizen initiative, no state has adopted this tool since 1972, and now some states are restricting the practice. You might have seen Ohio. Voters just defeated an effort by the legislature to raise the threshold for citizen initiatives, right? So this is front and center in the debate. On the surface, North Carolina does not appear to be super fertile ground for citizen initiatives. The bar for amending our state constitution is fairly high, and we have never even considered a proposal to establish an initiative or referendum. On the other hand, given the current misalignment between political outcomes and the popular will, especially in the state of North Carolina, maybe now is a good time to revisit the idea. So just to close, what would revisiting it look like? It might look like utilizing existing initiative powers. So I pose these as questions and not as fully thought out recommendations, but these would be intriguing areas for future study. Could municipal charter initiatives or local ordinance initiatives, where they're allowed, be used more frequently or strategically to generate turnout and provide kind of a proof of concept for a statewide initiative process? Could advocates devote greater focus and resources to the use of legislative referenda, including local bonds for issues like housing and conservation, which have a pretty good track record? Could we explore a limited expansion of initiative powers? Maybe more municipalities could petition the General Assembly for local ordinance initiative powers. Could a limited statewide process, maybe restricted to certain policies or implemented as a pilot, achieve support? And of course, in the long run, how do we build political support for a statewide citizen initiative process? Are there legislators that might serve as champions for this process within the General Assembly? Would reintroduction of initiative legislation help galvanize public support? Could initiatives be incorporated into the advocacy and electoral activities of C3 or C4 organizations? So these are just some questions. I don't have fully thought out answers to them, but they're questions that come to mind. Finally, and I'll close with a quote from Jane Addams, sometimes attributed to John Dewey, which is kind of my bottom line, which is that the cure for the ills of democracy is usually more democracy. And whatever the risks that these hold, this is a moment where this sort of wisdom feels especially timely. There are some additional resources, so you don't have to take my word for it. And the slide deck, which I'm happy to share, includes links to these. The National Council on State Legislatures, as always, has done some really good work compiling what every ballot initiative process in every state in the country looks like. There's the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, which is kind of a explicitly progressive organization. There's the Initiative and Referendum Institute at the University of Southern California, more of an academic institution. And then Ballotpedia is actually right now conducting what it describes as the largest ever research project that is examining the history of every ballot initiative in every state over time. And I don't know the time frame for when that will be completed, but there's some pretty good. They're providing some pretty good information on account of that as well. But let me stop there. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have and then get you all to your breakouts.
Thank you, Asher. Really appreciate the overview and the insightful comments and direction at the end. I think everyone has been so busy listening because we got a lot of facts and a lot of information fast that they haven't necessarily had time to formulate questions. And so we weren't planning to open it up orally because we have a strict time frame. We've got
That's
to go
totally
into
fine.
breakout rooms at 8. but we could take a few short questions if someone wants to speak. We have everyone on mute, but if you could raise your hand, and Ariane will unmute you if you want to ask a question. I see Jimmy Cochran Pratt has a question.
Yes, and a comment. I am co-president of the Equal Rights Amendment North Carolina Alliance, and we're made up of several organizations across the state of North Carolina, primarily, well, all 501c3s and 4. Because of the lack of variety in our state legislature, one of the things that we are planning on doing is to try to set up a question on the ballot by engaging in a long-term plan as many 501c3s and 501c4s to champion the Equal Rights Amendment in North Carolina. And what we want to do is make that all inclusive, as well as some other states like Nevada has done. So we have done some initial work on that, and we know it's a long-term plan, but you may care to comment on that or ask me questions.
I'll just say, first of all, I'm from Asheville, so thank you for your work out there. But I just say, I think one consideration is, as long as we are living in a world, well, first of all, if we're ever going to enact a truly statewide initiative process, it's going to have to go through the legislature in the form of a constitutional amendment. And so I think we can and should be looking to the coalition building that has happened around other issues that have successfully made it to the ballot, or that are trying right now to successfully make it to the ballot. You know, the other one that I'm most familiar with has been the efforts to surrounding redistricting reform, which came closer than a lot of people realized to getting on the ballot in 2020 before COVID hit and everything kind of fell apart. And so I think there are some lessons to be learned. And I say that with a cautious tone because the reality is even in a Democratic majority legislature, a constitutional amendment's going to require a 3/5 threshold, which means that it almost has to be bipartisan by definition. And so there, again, can and should be some bipartisan support for this, but trying to identify who is going to cross the aisle on it, who's going to take that risk, trying to develop messaging that maybe is responsive to the need to be bipartisan, and that doesn't reinforce the notion that this is just about, you know, progressives trying to circumvent a conservative government, right? I think those are all very important considerations to take in mind if you think about advocacy surrounding something like this.
Thanks, Asha. Would you take down your presentation so we can see more people? Thank you. And I see there's a hand, Patty Millar has a hand up. And we may be able to take one more question after hers if anyone else has a question. But go ahead, Patty.
So Asher, I was just, could you explain to me why it requires a constitutional amendment?
Well, there's sort of 1.5 answers to that. I guess the main reason is that nothing in the Constitution, you know, so every state that has adopted these has had to amend its constitution to do that, because nothing in the Constitution makes provisions for that. That's the basic answer. The half of an answer is that, and I think this is where I would need an assist from a constitutional lawyer, which I am not, but North Carolina actually in 1916 amended its constitution to in a way that restricted what the amendment calls private legislation. And some have interpreted that to actually create a sort of explicit prohibition of initiatives, as opposed to just a lack of authorization, an actual prohibition. That was called the Legislative Restrictions Amendment, I think. And we're sort of stuck with that. And so at a minimum, we need to get rid of that. But in most cases, states have explicitly created an initiative process through the Constitution. It looks like Ellen might know more about that than I do, or might have another thought on that.
Yeah, I was just nodding. So thank you, Asher. And we now have one more question from Ellen Weiner.
Hey there, thanks for tonight. My question is there a state that has close to what you would call an ideal citizens initiative? Or say, I'm just trying to think of what could be possible in an ideal situation. Okay, say our legislature approves it. What would be your suggestion of like an ideal situation? Say, okay, once it's approved, there would be a bipartisan or nonpartisan commission that you would submit, that would make sure that it was written correctly and not too long. Who would decide? Does it pass just majority, or would it be a percentage? In your view, so number one, is there a state that's already got a really good one? Or number two, just kind of so I can wrap my head around, because when you were mentioning the drawbacks, I hadn't thought about that. So what would be your thought?
Yeah, and I should be careful not to represent myself as expert on the details of every single state. Two of the states that I've sort of been following the closest, and I also have to be careful not to only pick states that are enacting policies I happen to like, as opposed to the ones that aren't. But the two states that I've been following the closest, that I think have been doing a lot of very interesting things, both through the ballot initiative process and in terms of designing the process recently, are Michigan and Colorado. And Colorado especially, I mentioned they're creating that kind of blue ribbon commission for the wording of it. They're really trying to get it right. There have been some cases where Colorado, has enacted something through initiative, and then the legislature has enacted it into law. But I don't, without them in front of me, I don't want to get the details of their design things wrong. I think in terms of the considerations, just in the abstract, I think it's, like everything, it's a balance. And maybe this is the closing comment, right? So you think, for example, of the signature threshold, right? You want a threshold that's going to be high enough that you don't have frivolous initiatives or too many initiatives or whatever. But gathering signatures for across a state, across a distributed geographical area, it's pretty expensive and hard work, right? And so if you set the threshold too high, then there might be some equity considerations. And so you see in a lot of states, it's usually a percentage threshold based on turnout in recent elections instead of an absolute threshold. That's a pretty smart way to go. For North Carolina's local initiatives, it's 10% of the population or 5,000 people, whichever is lower. So in other words, it can in no case be more than 5,000 people, even in pretty large cities. So that's another way you can try to balance that. I think having some kind of geographical distribution is important. Guess depends on the initiative, right? Maybe not for like a local bond initiative, but for anything statewide, making sure that there's some distribution across the state. Single issue as opposed to multiple issues. Plain wording, if not a commission, at least some kind of plain wording requirement. And then I think one thing from recent history is really tightening up the implementation by making very clear what the legislature or governor can and can't do during the implementation period. And then having at least a couple of years before opponents of the initiative, if it passes, can take another run at repealing it, so you don't get in a situation where policy's going back and forth. In the resources I provided, there was the National Council on State Legislatures way back in 2002 did a really good study on design best practices for designs. I would like to say it's outdated, but unfortunately, since there have been no new initiative processes adopted since then, it still pretty much holds up. Maybe some things they didn't fully anticipate, but if you want to really get down into the weeds of design, that's a pretty good resource for it.
Well, I want to thank Ellen for her question, because it's actually a perfect segue to the next part of our meeting. The study team will be divided into 4 groups with a facilitator and a recorder, and we're going to place everyone in groups. And we'd like to have a discussion, and the question that we're going to be asking is, what do you want the study team to consider as we work toward a position on citizens initiative? And so Ellen kind of started the discussion. Asher started to think through some of the issues we would be thinking through. So we hope that you will stay. We have 32 people on the call, 4 groups. It will be about 8 people per group. We will be in the groups for 30 minutes from 8 to 8:30. We will then reconvene. The recorder in the group will have 5 minutes each to report out on what the groups have come up with. So we hope you will continue with us for the next 3/4 of an hour.
All right, great. So, Ellen, anything before I dive into start the recap?
No, I think go ahead.
Okay, great. And just for those I haven't met, I met the folks in my breakout room, and a few of you are back here for the recap. Thank you. My name is Gay Williams. I'm a member of the Wake League and working as part of the Citizens Initiative Study Group. And so I am going to take us through a recap of what happened in the different rooms, and it is being recorded. So I'll just call on each of our note takers from the different rooms and ask you to give us just a few of the themes, and we'll take up to 5 minutes for each group. And of course, the facilitator, if you want to chime in, and I will, if you get really enthusiastic, I will kind of move us along if we get to the 5 minutes to make sure we have time for everyone. So let's start with Terry Landers. You were with Ellen and her group.
That's right. We're unmuted now. And in general, there was a lot of discussion about the reality of what our legislature is today in North Carolina, but that we should not wait. We need to continue to push forward now, get the word out, get people to start thinking about this now, line up champions on both sides of the aisle, because we're going to need to put whatever we do through the legislatures. And that we want to build this issue and be able to use it for perhaps elections in the future, asking the candidates what their opinions are on citizens initiatives, and make sure that everyone hears that the citizens in North Carolina do need to be heard. Reaching out to different organizations already around North Carolina, whether it be NOW or ERA North Carolina or AAUW, but building up coalitions so we can all work together towards the same end, realizing that this is a long-term situation. And one of the big things is to get redistricting on the ballot, so that when we are able to do so, we'll be able to get the legislature in a different position and therefore make all of this much easier. Also, that we needed to be aware of the consequences of this as we're moving forward. That devil is in the details, who writes the text, how the text is written. If it is complex and makes you think you're answering yes when you're really answering no, which we have certainly seen in North Carolina before. And all of that is extremely important and needs to be in the forefront as you're working.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Ellen, anything to add from your group? Nope. Okay, great. Super. Thank you so much, Terry. So we'll move on to oh, somebody adding something. Okay. We'll move on to Aiden Carson. Aiden, want to share themes from your group, please?
Yeah, there was also a discussion in our group about wondering what the opinions of the current legislators are right now, if we had any data on that, and also suggestion that we talk to our own representatives and find out how they feel about CI, and also talked about the fact that the legislators would probably want to know what our agenda is when we ask them that. And so there was some discussion about whether this all had to do with redistricting or if there were other things involved. And you know, we talked about how it's a broad issue, but redistricting is certainly kind of top of mind, I think. We wondered about how the municipal initiatives or ballot measures could be used to forward the position of citizens initiatives in general. And then we also wondered if there were other leagues or other organizations in other states working on the same thing, and wondered if maybe at the league's national convention we could kind of canvass and find out if there are other leagues doing the same thing, and also spread awareness about what we're doing. And it would be good to get some specific legislators to support it. And there was also a discussion about the need for allies.
Great. That's terrific. Thanks. That's great input as we go forward, as the study group goes forward. Barbara Burrell, anything to add there from your group? You'll have to unmute, Barbara.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
You are.
Okay. No, it went really fast. People had fantastic ideas. I was really so surprised that people had such good thoughts, and really anxious for us to go forward.
Great. Great. Thank you. Thanks so much. So I'll come to Jennifer next and then to Ernie. Jennifer, what about yours and Harry's group?
Yeah, we had a really good discussion given the time, and I would say that everybody was pretty supportive. There was also a lot of talk about the need to form a broad coalition and to really put a lot of effort into educating voters, get them familiar with the idea if they're not already familiar with it, and really sort of make this a topic of debate. People said there was no shortage of issues that they'd like to be able to see us advance, and there was interest in what kind of support there might be in the legislature currently, which I would say is not much, but you know, how we would, you know, again, looking at the coalition issue and how would we, you know, how would we build up groups that would be supportive. And but people were, one good suggestion was to follow up on what Asher mentioned of the Blue Ribbon Commission in Colorado and see where they're coming out and how we might benefit from, you know, what they are doing or what other states have done to overcome pitfalls also, you know, more generally. Again, have a speakers bureau, form a broad coalition, and how to link it to issues that people really care about to get people on board. And so that was really most of it. It was a very good discussion.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, 30 minutes seems like a long time when you go into it, but then it flies by. Harry, anything to add from your group? Harry, did you have anything to add? You'd have to unmute if you want to add something. There you go.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were going to call on me, and I wasn't sure you're asking. Now, Jennifer got it pretty good. Other than to say that I think that looking at the question, the primary question we had is probably too broad for people to come up with specifics. After just listening to Asher does a great job, and I've seen that twice, and I've taken notes. I took notes when I first saw it, but I think the question's too broad.
Yeah, and that's what we're starting with, that broad question for those who are participants are here, to give us a base, a foundation that we can build on. Thanks so much. All right, let's move over to Ernie then. And Ernie was taking notes in the group that I facilitated.
Yeah, and it was a good group. It was a good breakout. And just on a personal note, I know I've been to a good league meeting if I leave with more questions than I came with. So this tonight fit the bill. Let me just talk about some of our comments. We had a lot of broad comments, and we had 6 people in our group, and I think there was a lot of consensus. But the feeling right now is there is a lack of trust among voters, and particularly young voters, thinking that this is not a representative government. We've been, chopped up through redistricting, so there's a lack of representation and just an overwhelming sense of frustration. And so looking at this as a possibility of regaining voters' voices, it's appealing. And one of our participants said, well, this then might actually be the time for us to be looking at this because of this sense of frustration, and to appeal to younger people, as well as we're trying to get younger people involved in the league. So the other point that they made was this would be a good time due to the highly publicized successes in other states. One of our members said, they didn't know enough about it. They had seen negative, but they were encouraged by seeing the positive. And that was based on, again, the successes in states like Michigan. So, and using Michigan as an example, a couple of folks said that they were very interested in us looking at this so that we could then pursue very specific issues. And the two that popped up a number of times were redistricting and reproductive rights. What I was really encouraged about, just beyond the comments, were recommendations. We came up with, I think, a solid list of recommendations. And the overwhelming theme there is we are all just learning about this. So the recommendations were, they wanted to see the league and this committee do a very deep dive and go very specific about what the pros and what the cons are of trying to go ahead with this initiative. We want to look at detail of what other states have done, and I think we mean what other actual states have done, but we also want to see what other state leagues have done. We're trying to figure out a way. We want the league to come up with a way to kind of gauge the impact on that youth vote. If we're trying to appeal to people that have a very acute sense of frustration, how can we gauge, would this encourage them in any way? And tied into that was, we come to these meetings, we're league members, so we love the political, let's face it, we're political geeks, and trying to figure out how to translate the political geekiness of what we're talking about, not only to our members, but to the public, So figuring out a way that if once we decide we want to do this, how do we educate and how do we sell this plan? And also we wanted to know who else is looking at this so that we could be looking at future coalitions, future partners. And I'm going to sum it up here. One of the best comments I heard, and we heard it early on, this will be hard work to get it. And then once we get it, it's going to be even more hard work. So those were Group 4's comments.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ernie. And I'll just, as the putting my facilitator hat on, I'll just add kind of adjacent or in addition to what Ernie said, one of our participants talked about the geekiness, the wonkiness of even the terminology, and that the study group might consider a different brand for it than Citizens Initiative, because those words don't necessarily resonate and mean something to the general public. So direct democracy resonated, and not that it has to be that term, but I just thought that was an interesting thing the study group could consider as well. Well, thank you all. Wow, definitely heard some themes running through all the groups, and we'll be collecting all of the notes from the note takers, and please send those to Ellen Rackhow and Jennifer Bremer, and we will share a summary of those notes out to all of the folks who participated. So if for anybody, even those who didn't come back for the recap session, they'll get the notes out as well. And just want a quick plug for the study group, since we have a minute, that if you're interested in participating with the study group, please reach out to Ellen Rackhow or Jennifer Bremer, and they'll be happy to talk to you about potentially getting involved. Although we've already done some work, we'd certainly welcome additional league members to participate. We've tried to get a broad representation from across the state, and I think we've gotten a pretty good representation, but of course we would welcome more folks. We know a lot of people are focused on get out the vote, and that is super important. And I'm looking at Helen Zimmerman because she's in the middle, and she's a co-lead of our voter services group in Wake County. But if you're interested in this longer term work, we'd love to have you. So with that, we will close out for the evening 15 minutes early, give you 15 minutes back, as they say. But what you did is you gave us an hour and 45 minutes I'm just glad it was raining. So you weren't thinking you could be having fun somewhere else. No, I do hope you have a good day. And I think it's going to be raining in a good part of the state tomorrow. So stay dry. And we hope to see you on another call soon. Take care.